It started as a whisper in town, a story passed between nervous mothers and old men at the bar. A strange woman had been seen near the woods at the edge of town, standing perfectly still in the misty darkness. She was tall, unnaturally thin, and wrapped in a tattered, old-fashioned dress that clung to her like wet cloth. But the thing that made people shudder, the thing that sent those whispers spreading like fire, was her smile. She never stopped smiling. Not the fleeting, polite curve of lips. Not the warm, toothy grin of a friendly stranger. No, her smile was something grotesque, something carved too wide, stretching her skin in a way that seemed painful. It cut across her face as though it didn't belong there, as if it had been forced upon her. The first to see her was a boy named Daniel. He had been riding his bike home just after sunset when he noticed her standing beneath the street lamp, motionless. He slowed, unsure if she needed help, until he saw her face. That awful, impossible grin. Her teeth, yellowed and uneven, gleamed under the flickering light. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto his. She didn't move, didn't speak, just smiled. Daniel's blood turned cold. The longer he looked, the more his stomach churned. The smile was wrong. It wasn't just on her lips, it seemed to stretch into her cheeks, cutting into her skin. His heart pounded as he forced himself to move, pedaling faster and faster, not daring to look back. By the time he reached home, he could still feel her eyes on him. That night, he barely slept, haunted by the image of her face burned into the back of his eyelids. And then, the next night, she was closer. The Thompsons saw her standing in their backyard just after midnight, her hands clasped in front of her, her spine too straight, her smile wider than ever. Mr. Thompson had gone outside with a bat, threatening to call the police. But when he blinked, just a single blink, she was suddenly at the base of his porch steps. Closer, her head tilted, her mouth stretching as if it might split open. He swore he could hear something, a faint, wet creaking like skin being pulled too tight. His breath hitched in his throat. His legs refused to move. And then, she whispered, "You see me now." Mr. Thompson slammed the door and locked it, his hands shaking too much to dial the police. When the sun rose, she was gone, but the imprint of her presence lingered like a rotting scent in the air. People started seeing her everywhere. At the gas station, standing between the pumps. In the alley behind the diner, staring into the window. On the edge of the forest, still as a corpse, smiling in the rain. Always closer. No one knew who she was, where she came from, or what she wanted. But one thing was certain. She never stopped smiling. And she never left once she saw you. By the time people realized the woman wasn't just a trick of the mind, wasn't some delusion shared between tired workers and over-imaginative children, it was too late. She had already seen them. She had already chosen them. The first disappearance was Daniel. His mother swore she had tucked him in a bed that night, kissed his forehead, and turned on his nightlight just the way he liked. But by morning, his bed was empty. The sheets were rumpled, twisted, but there was no sign of a struggle. No open window, no force lock. Just a single, awful thing left behind. A smile. Not a picture, not a drawing. A bloody, human smile. Skin peeled from lips, shaped into a crude, curling grin, and placed carefully on his pillow. The police came, questions were asked, searches were launched, but no one found Daniel. Only the smile. Then Mrs. Thompson vanished. Mr. Thompson had been sleeping beside her, hand wrapped loosely around hers, when he woke up to cold sheets. The bedroom door still locked. No sign of her leaving. But the moment he turned over, his stomach curdled. On her pillow, another smile. This one messier, more rushed. The flesh still wet. By the end of the week, 6 people were gone. No bodies. No sounds of struggle. No broken locks. Just those awful skin-flayed grins left in their place. And always, the night before, someone had seen her, standing just outside a window, watching, smiling. People stopped going out at night. Doors were double-locked, windows nailed shut, candles burned in quiet desperation. The town priest started leaving handwritten prayers in the mailboxes of every home. But nothing stopped her, because the rule had already been broken. You see me now, That's what she had whispered to Mr. Thompson, what she had whispered to all of them at some point. And if she saw you, if you locked eyes with her even once, it was only a matter of time. It didn't matter if you fled, if you hid, if you boarded yourself up in a basement, refusing to sleep. She was patient. She would stand outside your home for hours, for nights, for weeks, her expression never faltering. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you could hear a quiet, wet stretching sound, like the sound of overworked tendons pulling too hard. Her smile widening, her eyes locked onto yours. And then, one night, you'd wake up to silence. An empty bed, a bloodied smile, and nothing else. There was only one man who survived after seeing her, an old drunk named Marvin. A widower, a nobody, the kind of man who spent his nights at the local bar mumbling about things he'd seen in the war. One evening, as he stumbled home through the cold, he saw her. She was waiting for him, standing at the far end of the street, arms limp at her sides, her dress ragged and damp. That unbearable smile cutting across her face. Marvin, half drunk and half mad, did something no one else had ever done. He didn't look away. He didn't run, didn't blink, didn't cower behind a locked door. Instead, he stared back, and, for the first time, her expression changed. Her mouth quivered. Her grin faltered for just a second, something unreadable passing behind those hollow eyes. And Marvin, reeking of whiskey and bad decisions, spoke through his cracked lips. "What are you?" A slow blink. The smile curled tighter. She lifted a single, bony finger to her lips. "Chill." Then, just as suddenly as she had come, she was gone. Marvin never spoke of that night again. Never walked alone after dark. Never stayed in one place for too long. And he never smiled. Not once. The disappearances stopped. People moved on. Houses were rebuilt. Stories were buried. And in time, the town convinced itself that she had been nothing more than a shadow, a bad dream. But every so often, someone swears they see her, standing outside their house in the middle of the night, watching, smiling, waiting, because she never left, and she never will. Long after the disappearances stopped, after the town convinced itself that she was nothing more than an old wives' tale, there was one place that never moved on. A house. The Thompson house sat at the edge of town, near the woods where the mist lingered thickest. No one lived there anymore. After Mrs. Thompson vanished, and Mr. Thompson drank himself into a stupor, trying to forget, the house became something else. No one dared go near it. Not because of ghosts. No, ghosts would have been a comfort. But because of what people saw there. The shadows were always a little too long in that yard. The windows, even in the middle of the day, looked darker than they should. People who passed by swore they saw movement behind the curtains, though no one had lived there in years. And sometimes at night, only on the nights when the air was deathly still, someone would see her, standing in the backyard, staring at the house, smiling, waiting. 10 years after the disappearances, there was a boy named Calvin who had heard all the stories but didn't believe them. He was 16, too old for ghost stories, too stubborn to be afraid. "She's not real," he told his friends one summer night. "It's just some stupid story to keep kids from sneaking out." But his friends weren't so sure. "You don't mess with her," one of them whispered. "Not if you want to sleep again." Calvin only laughed. He was young, reckless, and filled with the kind of arrogance that only comes from thinking you're untouchable. So he made a decision. He was going to prove everyone wrong. And he was going to do it tonight. At exactly 11:58 p.m., Calvin stood outside the abandoned Thompson house, flashlight in hand. The air was thick, humid, pressing against his skin like a damp cloth. The street was silent. The trees barely moved. His friends had chickened out, of course. They had walked with him as far as the corner, then refused to go any further. "We'll wait here," they said, standing in the yellow glow of the street lamp. "Cowards." Calvin rolled his eyes, stepped onto the overgrown lawn, and whispered to himself, "It's just a house." Then he went inside. The air inside was heavy, stale. It smelled of rot, of time standing still. Dust coated every surface, thick enough to blur what had once been furniture. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips, exposing the skeletal remains of wooden beams beneath. And the quiet, God, the quiet. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was an active silence, like the house was listening, watching. Calvin let out a shaky breath and forced himself to move deeper. He started in the kitchen. Empty cabinets, broken dishes. Moved to the living room. Moldy couch, dead fireplace. He was about to call it quits when he noticed something. The hallway. There was something off about it. The further he looked down, the darker it seemed to get, as though the shadows swallowed the light from his flashlight. At the very end of the hall, there was a door, and it was open, just a crack. A thin sliver of darkness waited beyond it, like a gaping mouth. Calvin hesitated. Then, from somewhere inside that room, a whisper. "You see me now?" His breath stopped. He hadn't spoken. No one else was inside. But something was breathing beyond that door. A wet, slow inhale, then a rattling exhale like lungs filled with something thick and wrong. Calvin took a step back. The door creaked open an inch more. The darkness inside shifted. Then suddenly, a flash of white. A grin. Stretched. Carved. Wrong. Calvin ran. He sprinted through the house, feet pounding against rotting wood, lungs burning. As he reached the front door, something moved behind him. Something fast, something that shouldn't be that fast. A whisper slid against his ear, cold as death. "Why are you leaving?" He screamed, burst through the door, fell onto the front steps. His friends were already running toward him, shouting his name. But Calvin didn't hear them, because when he looked up at the house one last time, she was standing in the doorway, still, watching, smiling, and her smile was bigger than before. Calvin never spoke of that night again. He never returned to the house, never walked alone after dark. But he wasn't the same. His mother said he stopped sleeping. He lost weight. He started covering every mirror in his room, refusing to see his own reflection. Because sometimes, when the lights were out, when the house was quiet, when he was alone, he saw her in the corner of his room, in the reflection of a turned-off TV, in the window, standing too close, watching, waiting, and smiling. Because once she sees you, she never stops watching, and she never, ever leaves. People say the woman is still out there. Maybe she's in another town now, standing outside someone else's house. Maybe she's closer than you think. Or maybe she's already watching you. Maybe you saw something just now, out of the corner of your eye. A figure, a shape. Maybe you should turn around, just to check, just to make sure there's nothing there. But whatever you do, don't look too long, because if you see her, she sees you too, and she never stops smiling. After Calvin's encounter, the town tried to ignore what had happened, tried to pretend it was nothing more than a boy's imagination running wild in an old, forgotten house. But the whispers started again. More people began seeing her, not just at the Thompson house, but everywhere. At the gas station, standing just outside the flickering neon lights. At the school, watching from the edge of the football field while practice went on. In the cemetery, where even the dead seemed uneasy in their graves. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't attack. She just smiled. And every night, she was a little closer. The town priest tried to bless the homes, but his hands trembled as he pressed his cross against the doors. A group of young men drove out to the Thompson house one night, armed with baseball bats and beer-fueled courage. But by dawn, their truck was still there, engine running, doors open, and seats empty. They were never seen again. And in the middle of the street, right outside the truck, was something else. Another smile, carved into a strip of raw, peeling skin. That was when the fear turned into panic. People started leaving town. Homes went up for sale, but no one would buy them. Parents kept their children inside. The local news refused to report on the disappearances, but everyone knew. Something was wrong here, and she was the cause. Elliot Graves was the town's last hope. He had been the sheriff for almost 20 years. A man built from steel nerves and heavy boots, the kind of person who never backed down from anything. But even he wasn't ready for her. He had ignored the stories at first, brushed off the disappearances as runaways or tragic accidents. But then one night, his radio crackled, and a voice he hadn't heard in years spoke through the static. Elliot. His breath hitched. His blood ran cold, because the voice belonged to his wife who had died 8 years ago. "She sees you now," the voice whispered. The radio went silent. Then, from the reflection in his office window, a grin. wide, unnatural. Behind him, Elliot spun around, his gun already drawn, but the room was empty. That was the night Sheriff Graves finally believed. And so, he did what no one else had dared to do. He started digging through old police records, hospital files, obituaries that had yellowed with time. And he found something. A name. Margaret Hale. A woman who had lived in town long before the Thompson house. Long before even Elliot was born. She had been a widow, quiet and strange, living alone at the edge of town. No one paid much attention to her, until people started going missing. Children, neighbors, strangers passing through. All of them gone, without a single trace. Except for one thing, a smile, carved from their own skin. When the townsfolk finally caught on, they stormed her house with torches and rope, dragging her screaming into the night. "You'll see me again," she had whispered. And then, they hanged her, right in the center of town. Her body dangled in the wind, her neck snapped at an awful angle. And yet, even in death, she had still been smiling. Sheriff Graves knew what he had to do. He had to end this. He drove out to the Thompson house alone, armed with a shotgun, a Bible, and a rusted shovel. If she had died once, she could die again. At least, that's what he told himself. But the moment he stepped onto the property, the air changed. The world grew silent. And then, Elliot, he froze. The voice came from behind him, close enough that he could feel the breath on his neck. "You see me now." Slowly, with shaking hands, Elliot turned. And there she was, Margaret Hale, standing inches away. Her dress was soaked in old blood. Her skin stretched impossibly tight. Her grin unnatural, carved too wide. The flesh at the edges raw and glistening. And her eyes, hollow, endless, wrong. Elliot fired the shotgun. The blast tore through her chest. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't stop smiling. Then, she took a step forward. Another. Closer, closer, until she was right in front of him, her head tilting, her grin widening too far. Elliot tried to run, but the ground wasn't there anymore. The world twisted, warped, the sky itself bending inward. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, the sheriff's car was found outside the Thompson house, its engine still running. But Elliot Graves was gone. All that remained was his badge, lying in the dirt. And of course, a smile, carved deep into the wooden porch, as if someone had been watching, waiting, and grinning. The town never recovered. More people left. Houses stood abandoned, their windows dark and empty. But even after all these years, some say she's still there, watching, waiting, smiling. She never left. And if you see her, if you lock eyes with her for even a moment, it's already too late, because now she sees you too, and she never, ever leaves. By the time Nathan Holloway returned to Blackwood, the town was already dead. He had grown up here, played baseball on the school field, snuck beers with his friends behind the gas station, kissed his first love beneath the old oak tree in the center of town. But that tree was gone now, split down the middle by lightning. The gas station's windows were shattered, shells ransacked, and the school burned to the ground. Blackwood wasn't abandoned. It was erased, as if something had swallowed it whole, leaving only the bones of what once was. And yet, as Nathan stepped out of his car, he could feel it. He wasn't alone. There were no cars, no voices, no birds in the sky, but something was here, watching, waiting. And then he saw the house, the Thompson house. It was the only building still standing, and its door was wide open. Nathan's flashlight flickered as he stepped inside. The air smelled of wet wood and rot. The floor creaked beneath his boots, groaning like something in pain. But the worst part? The walls. They weren't just cracked. They weren't just old. They were covered, plastered with smiles. Not drawings, not carvings, but faces. Skins stretched tight like canvas. Mouths pulled back too far, frozen in silent, eternal grins. Nathan gagged, stumbled backward, and then he heard it. A footstep, not from above, not from behind, from beneath. The basement. Nathan knew what every horror movie told him to do. Get out, run, don't look back. But he had come too far, so he stepped forward and down. The basement was worse. The air was thick, heavy like breath on his skin. But the real horror? The mirror. An enormous, floor-to-ceiling mirror, cracked in places but still whole. Nathan lifted his flashlight. His reflection stared back. And then, it blinked. Nathan didn't, but the reflection did. It lifted its hand, slow and unnatural, as if testing him. And then, it smiled. Not his smile. Her smile. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The reflection leaned closer. And as it did, the glass began to ripple. Like water. Like a portal. And from the other side, she was coming through. Margaret Hale. Her skin was wrong. Too smooth, too tight, too stretched. Her mouth too big, too wide, too open. A grin made from suffering. And she was stepping out. Nathan turned, ran, but the basement door was gone. The walls stretched further. The ceiling grew higher. The world warped. And then, behind him, "Where are you going?" Her voice was inside his skull. "You see me now." Nathan turned one last time, and the last thing he saw was her mouth, opening too wide, too deep, too endless. And then, the next morning, the sun rose over Blackwood. But the town was gone. No roads led to it. No maps remembered it. Only an empty field remained, whispering with the wind. And far away, another town, another quiet, sleepy place where people felt safe, until they started seeing her. At first, it was just a glimpse, a shape at the end of the street, a reflection that wasn't quite right. And then, one by one, people began disappearing, leaving behind only smiles. Because once she sees you, she never, ever leaves. And if you're reading this, if your room is dark, if you feel like something is watching you, check the mirror. But whatever you do, don't smile back.